Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Random Call Sign. Welcome to a new video, and today we're going to talk about multi-air technology that is available in the FCA or Fiat Chrysler Automotive Company on engines that are available on Fiat Chryslers, of course, and Alfa Romeos. I know today I'm going to look like a very low-rent version of Engineering Explained. I just nicked this from my daughter. This is an IKEA board. It's dual side. But basically this is the best way to explain this technology. It's quite different from everything that is available at the moment. Doesn't matter if it's VTEC, VTEC, ValveMatic, it doesn't really matter. This is a completely different type of technology, and also a very interesting one. Later on I would like to touch in some of the points that Mr. Regular did on one of his videos about the Alfa Romeo Mito. He goes about the multi-air technology and how it works. There are a few issues on what he says, but it's nothing major. I would just like to pinpoint some of the issues. So this is a multi-air engine, or at least the internals. I know it doesn't look like anything else that you've seen, but it's actually quite simple how it operates, and actually very, very interesting. So how it works is that there is a single overhead cam, and like every single overhead cam in the market, it does have the lobes for the intake, which is in yellow, and the exhaust. On the exhaust part, this part over here, the exhaust cam lobes are on a specific profile. They don't advance or retard like in dual VVTIs, for example. But what makes it to work like a dual overhead cam, and it does even though it's a single overhead cam, is that the cam lobes don't dictate the profile nor the timing of the valves. So even though it's physically connected over here, it doesn't tell how to open the intake valve. What it does, this intake lobe, it's basically connects to this roller and this finger over here that pressurizes this area and pressurizes some oil. Quite a bit similar like VTEC, but not quite like that. So the control unit has a solenoid over here and understands where the timing of the intake valve is, somewhat. But then it can decide, in accordance with the loads, in accordance with the speed you're taking, it can decide how to open the valves. Not just how to open the valves, when to open the valves, and how much to open the valves. But here's the kicker. This control unit can open the valves on the intake for each intake stroke more than once. This is the coolest part of the multi-air. Now this is the part where I really look like a low-rent version of Engineering Explained. I'm sorry for using this format, but it's the best way to explain. And if you see this video, please do a multi-air video because you would be explaining better than I do. But for all the given purposes, this is the best way to explain. The main advantage of how Fiat operates and how multi-air works is the lowering of costs. There's one thing that I haven't written here is for the engines that are 1.4 in displacement, they are basically the same engine for about 30 years. They're called the Fire engine, or fully integrated robotized engine. It's basically the same block for 30 years. They've changed one thing here and there. The internals might be aluminum or cast iron, whatever, depending on the usage, but the overall engine is the same. What changes? It's basically these modules, the dual overhead cams. If there are 16 valves, they have 8 valves versions, and now they have the multi-air versions. Another advantage of lowering these costs in regards of multi-air is they don't have the throttle body. The throttle body is basically the solenoid. The solenoid tells how the intake valves should operate, how much to open, when to open, how to close, when to close, and all of that stuff. So you don't need this big chunk of metal that you need to pay for it. So no throttle body, less cost for the consumer, less cost on development, less cost on building the stuff. Then you have also a single overhead cam. Therefore, because it works like a dual overhead cam, you can just throw it away or don't build it there. It's just a waste of money building it. And one thing that Mr. Regular said is that these are interference engines, but even though they are interference engines, they don't work like one, because the intake part is controlled, like I said, by the solenoid. If the solenoid doesn't have any input, it just stays with the valves closed, and the valves close really, really fast. Now, on the environmental part of it, you have lower emissions, 10% less CO2, 60% less nitrous oxides, so NOs and NO2s. So it's really good for using in a city, for example. It lowers the risk of cancer and all that stuff, and also the particulates, they drop quite dramatically. They're much better than almost everything else out there. With all of that, this is done with a 10% fuel consumption, so there's an improvement of 10%. And there you have 10% more power and 15% more torque. So you can use better the profiles of the cams, you can use better the cams, you can tell when to burn, how to open, and all of that stuff. In this, because you have better usability at any given load, you can build lots of profiles when you have an intake profile or intake valve that can open or close how the computer wants. And you have the regular full lifts on, for example, on VTECs, IVTECs. You can do this like late intake valve opening. You can do also the partial loads with the VVT parts. But one thing or two things that you cannot do are these two: the early intake valve closing and the multi-lift. So this, especially the multi-lift, this is really interesting, especially on city driving. So all of these are bell curves, right? And this would be like a regular opening closing of a cam lobe, but with a multi-lift. On the early part of the intake, you see it's going to open, but then it closes and it opens again. This is really good for very low loads, using, for example, in start-stop situations, and you can reduce massively nitrous oxide pollution. So this is the interesting part of MultiAir, and where it's really advanced and better than everything else in terms of technology. So for the last part of the video, I'll be addressing some points that Mr. Regular said on his Mito video. About the car itself, I totally agree with everything he said about the car. I think it's a really weird car and it shouldn't exist, and thankfully they're gonna stop selling it. But I do take a bit of exception of what he said about MultiAir. One of the things that he said is that MultiAir is a needless complication, when in reality it is quite the opposite. Why? Because it's a single overhead cam. It doesn't have any VVT controllers. It doesn't have any VVL controllers. One part does everything. So the MultiAir part does everything and has less moving parts. So that means it's cheaper to build. So it's not really a needless complication, it's a simplification. He also said that it requires oil just for the MultiAir thing. It doesn't. It's the same oil as the engine oil, though it requires a quite specific oil and has to be the specific viscosity and specific specifications for that engine oil, which in Europe is 5W40 ACEA-C3. It's quite a mouthful, but what happens when you don't use the correct oil, and does happen a bit, is that the MultiAir section or the MultiAir unit has a catastrophic failure. So do use that specific oil, otherwise you just risk spending money on a new MultiAir unit. Now, one last thing that he said is that, why don't you go full free valve like Koenigsegg? Well, I must say that even Koenigsegg isn't going full free valve, because free valve isn't here at the moment. You can't buy a free valve car. It's still on tests. It's the best technology that will ever be for a long time on internal combustion engines, because it can do everything. And even though MultiAir is a simplification because it's a single overhead cam instead of a dual overhead cam, and single overhead cams have less parasitic drag on the system because it's one less camshaft to basically power with the belt. Free valve doesn't have any, so it will always be better. Another thing that he said, and I just remembered, is that why don't you go direct injection? It's such a advanced thing, and why don't you go direct injection? Why you go port injection? But then you talk about Koenigsegg, like I said, and Koenigsegg doesn't use direct injection because it's cheaper to manufacture port injection. It's cheaper, and because you can control all of these things, you have other advantages. You have less carbon deposits, so you can have engine running clean much longer. You can do a lot of things with the MultiAir engine, and that you can also do on a free valve up to a certain degree. And like I said, free valve also uses port injection and not direct injection. But anyways, guys, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this rip-off of engineering explained. And once again, I'm sorry for using this specific format, but I think it's the best to address all of this on the MultiAir. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to press like, subscribe, check Engineering Explained, and I'll see you next time.